Welcome to Fashionable Kanvas, a curated space where fashion, culture, and global trends intersect. Today, our focus turns to ATiiSSU and its defining impact on the modern architecture of headwear style. Let's begin.
So, you just heard the perfectly polished intro, right? And it sounds like we're about to talk about another standard traditional luxury brand.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of ATiiSSU is actually built on this massive paradox. And that is exactly what we are unpacking today in this deep dive.
Yeah, it really is a striking contradiction to observe, especially right now. I mean, just look at the broader landscape of global fashion today.
It's just so loud.
Exactly. It's incredibly loud. We are seemingly trapped in these relentless, hyper-maximalist cycles. The industry essentially demands constant noise.
Right.
And, it relies so heavily on the mythology of this superstar celebrity designer, like the creative director whose personal fame often completely eclipses the actual garments they're producing.
Oh, 100%. You see the designer's face everywhere before you even see a single piece of clothing.
Right. But then you have ATiiSSU. They're achieving this massive global fixation by operating in the absolute inverse. We're talking extreme restraint, a meticulously quiet footprint, and absolutely no publicly identified singular designer taking a bow at the end of a runway.
Which is wild. Like, I look at the strategy and my immediate reaction is just skepticism. Because historically, luxury consumers buy into a mythology, right?
They absolutely do.
They buy into the tortured genius of a Lee Alexander McQueen or, the eccentric vision of a John Galliano, without that central human figure to act as like the lightning rod for consumer affection. I have to wonder how a brand sustains its momentum.
It's a fair question.
I mean, it feels closer to like a high-end tech incubator or maybe an elite architectural firm where the project itself is the star rather than an individual artist, signing the bottom of the canvas.
Okay, that architectural firm comparison is incredibly accurate, especially when you actually look at their corporate DNA, because ATiiSSU doesn't operate like a heritage atelier in Paris.
Right, they aren't sitting around sketching in a dusty studio.
Exactly. It functions as an internal creative project under the umbrella of iCombined.
Okay, wait. iCombined, that's the same group behind Gentle Monster, right?
Yes, exactly. The same collective creative group responsible for Gentle Monster in the eyewear sector and Tamburins in cosmetics.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that fundamentally changes the business model then. Because if you're operating under the iCombined umbrella, you are inherently adopting a structure that values collective output over, like, individual ego.
Precisely. And what that collective structure allows them to do is completely bypass the traditional and, frankly, archaic seasonal wholesale cycles.
The endless spring, summer, fall, winter treadmill.
Right. A traditional fashion house is chained to those calendars because they have to sell a cohesive lifestyle vision to buyers months in advance. But ATiiSSU, they operate much more like software drops.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, because there is no single creative director's, seasonal inspiration to dictate the narrative. So the collective can focus purely on iterating and perfecting their core conceptual language.
So they're just constantly updating the hardware, essentially.
Exactly. Their aesthetic naturally aligns with that highly experimental, disruptive universe that Gentle Monster already established, but they're applying it to the architecture of headwear.
Okay, so let's pull on that thread a bit, because if the brand operates like a tech incubator dropping iterations of a product, and there is no charismatic founder to distract the consumer with some compelling backstory,
Right.
then the physical product has to bear the entire weight of the brand's identity.
Yeah.
But we are talking about hats here.
Yes. Just hats.
And headway is traditionally treated as an afterthought. It's an accessory to finish a silhouette, or worse, it's just a walking billboard for a giant logo. So how does a brand build an entire recognizable identity on something so notoriously supplementary?
Well, for ATiiSSU, the identity is the discipline. Because they don't rely on a giant logo to broadcast value to the world, they have to rely entirely on precision.
Okay.
The product itself literally becomes the personality. They treat headwear not as an accessory, but as a primary sculptural object. For them, form is always considered before function.
Okay, but I want to visualize the actual mechanics of this for you, the listener. When the sources describe their signature vocabulary as architectural tailoring, what does that actually mean for a piece of headwear? I mean, how do you tailor a hat architecturally without it just looking like a costume piece?
It really comes down to the manipulation of tension and proportion. So think about your standard 6-panel cotton cap.
Sure, like a standard baseball cap.
Right. The standard cap just molds to the wearer's head. But ATiiSSU utilizes materials chosen strictly for their structural behavior rather than their decorative appeal. We are talking about high-density, heavyweight fabrics,
Like what exactly?
like rigid gabardines or heavily structured nylons that just completely refuse to drape. And then they might even incorporate subtle internal wire framing or highly specific fusing techniques.
Oh, wow. So they're engineering it.
They are. This allows the crown of the hat to hold a distinct, almost geometric silhouette regardless of whose head it's actually sitting on.
So the hat dictates its own shape rather than the wearer's head dictating the shape of the hat.
Yes, exactly. And they introduce these very subtle distortions into that shape, so maybe moving a seam slightly off-axis or, extending a brim at an unexpected sloped angle.
Well, right. Something that just feels slightly off, but in a good way.
Exactly. It challenges the traditional form of the hat, but because the execution is so rigorously controlled, it never looks absurd. It just looks, well, highly evolved.
And the color palette clearly plays a huge role in that control, too, because the notes emphasize this deep, deep commitment to neutrality, like stark blacks, concrete grays, off-whites.
Yeah, very muted.
But surely, in a market driven by visual overstimulation, just think about the endless scrolling on TikTok or Instagram. There's a massive risk here. Doesn't this extreme subtlety, this lack of loud color or branding, just render the product invisible? Like, how do you go viral if you are essentially whispering?
Well, that assumes the consumer actually wants to be yelled at.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, I would argue we are hitting a point of profound maximalist fatigue when literally everything in your feed, your environment, your closet is chaotic, loud, and aggressively demanding your attention.
It's exhausting.
It is. So a perfectly tailored, structurally sound, minimal black cap, that feels like a deep breath. The restraint itself is the flex.
Well, restraint is the flex. I love that.
It's true. It offers the consumer conceptual clarity over excess. And furthermore, this discipline allows them to completely ignore gendered or seasonal frameworks. They aren't sitting around designing a men's summer hat.
Right.
They are simply designing a shape. It's concept over classification.
Okay, I see the appeal of that conceptual clarity. But, there is a ceiling to silence.
Yeah.
If you are operating a fiercely independent, highly restrained, faceless brand, you are eventually going to hit a threshold where organic growth just stalls out. To scale globally, you need an amplifier.
You do.
You need a human face to project this quiet universe to a wider audience. But you can't just hire, a random Hollywood actor without shattering the very tension you just spent years building.
Exactly. Which brings us to the cultural alignment that the sources refer to as the Felix effect.
Right, and this is a massive pivot for a brand that is so deeply rooted in anonymity. ATiiSSU bringing in Felix from Stray Kids as the face of their collection is fascinating, because it is not just a standard ambassador contract, is it?
No, not at all.
As you said, it's a cultural alignment. But why him specifically? What makes this different from any other luxury house just tapping a K-pop idol to boost their quarterly sales? We see that all the time.
We do see it all the time. But to understand why Felix specifically works, we really have to look at the ecosystem ATiiSSU operates within. They are headquartered in Seoul.
Right.
And Seoul is currently the absolute epicenter of fashion, digital culture, music, and beauty. It is a city where the traditional boundaries between these industries they do not exist. They are completely porous.
It's all just one massive creative ecosystem.
Exactly. And ATiiSSU thrives in this environment. They absorb the rapid-fire energy of Seoul's youth culture, but they still manage to maintain their slow, meditative design identity.
And Felix is kind of the human embodiment of that exact intersection, because he possesses a very specific duality that is, well documented within pop culture.
It's very well documented.
He has this ethereal, delicate, almost soft visual presence, which is then immediately contrasted by this incredibly deep, grounded, and powerful voice. He is basically a walking study in tension.
He is. And that duality perfectly mirrors the tension ATiiSSU builds into its headwear. It's that exact balance between a soft, neutral palette and rigid architectural control.
Oh, that's such a brilliant connection.
Yeah, and by integrating Felix into their visual universe, ATiiSSU totally avoids the typical merch trap that plagues so many fashion and music collaborations.
Ugh, that merch trap is lethal to high fashion.
It really is.
Usually when a conceptual brand tries to tap into a massive fandom, they just dumb down the product.
Right.
They print a logo or a tour date on a standard cheap hoodie, and they just rely on the fans' blind loyalty to move inventory. It completely dilutes the brand equity.
But here, the product remains fiercely uncompromising. The hats do not change to accommodate the fandom.
Right, they aren't suddenly making neon pink caps.
Exactly. Rather, the fandom is invited to elevate their own aesthetic to meet the discipline of the brand. Wearing a ATiiSSU becomes like a proximity key for stays for the Stray Kids fans.
Right, it unlocks something for them.
It grants them access to the sophisticated visual language that Felix already inhabits. It elevates the fan from just being a consumer of merchandise to being a participant in a high-concept design dialogue.
That's amazing. Going back to our earlier tech incubator analogy, it feels almost like Felix was brought in as an open source collaborator, or like a guest developer.
Yes, that's exactly it.
He didn't redesign the operating system. He just added this massively powerful new layer of code that allowed millions of new users to suddenly interface with the brand. It proves that intense fan culture and rigorous high-concept fashion can occupy the exact same space without compromising either side.
It is a phenomenal balancing act. And, that careful curation of identity, that absolute insistence on maintaining tension, it is not restricted just to the garments or their choice of ambassador.
No, it spills over into everything.
Right. It dictates how the brand occupies physical space, too.
Well, let's explore that physical space, because the rejection of traditional fashion norms extends straight into their retail strategy. The sources detail how ATiiSSU entirely rejects the traditional runway spectacle, which honestly makes sense.
It completely makes sense, because the traditional runway is all about scale and noise. It is essentially a 10-minute parade meant to generate easily digestible social media clips.
Right, it's just content fodder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for a brand whose entire ethos is built on slow, deliberate architectural observation, a runway makes zero sense. If they participate in the fashion calendar at all, it is through intimate, highly controlled installations.
Right, they prioritize the image as a lasting experience rather than a fleeting performance.
Exactly. So their cinematic lookbooks essentially act as their runway. But the true manifestation of their aesthetic lives inside their retail stores. And looking at the architectural notes on these spaces, it really challenges the very definition of what a store is supposed to do.
Oh, absolutely. Because a standard retail environment is designed to overwhelm you.
Right.
It gives you endless options to maximize the chance of a purchase. But ATiiSSU's sound more like modern art galleries.
They really are highly controlled environments. We're talking clean architectural lines, brushed steel, meditative color palettes. And they employ absolute zero clutter.
Right, and I want to emphasize what zero clutter means in this context for you listening. Because we aren't just talking about tidy shelves.
No, not at all.
We are talking about walking into a massive room and seeing perhaps 5 items total.
Yes. The negative space is literally treated as a core component of the product. They use forced perspective and strategic isolating lighting.
Like a museum.
Exactly like a museum. A single structured hat might just sit completely alone on a pedestal under a spotlight.
Which is insane for retail. But the physical isolation of the garment demands that you stop and actually observe its form. You cannot casually browse an ATiiSSU store.
You can't.
The space forces you into a state of focus. It's almost like a sensory deprivation tank.
Yes. And drawing again from their II combined lineage, you often see the integration of kinetic art or subtle atmospheric installations that dictate the entire pacing of the room.
Right.
So when you step off a chaotic street in Seoul or Tokyo and you enter this perfectly muted, methodically lit space, the absence of noise becomes the ultimate luxury.
It is incredibly clever psychology. You are paying for the relief of not being overwhelmed. They have literally commodified tranquility.
Commodified tranquility. That is a brilliant way to frame it. They have taken the overwhelming nature of modern consumption and offered a direct antidote. Every single touch point of the brand, from the heavy, rigid gabardine of the hats, to the ethereal duality of Felix, to the stark negative space of the retail floor, it is all unified by this singular language of restraint.
So synthesizing all of this source material, what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener? Why does the rise of an architectural headwear brand matter beyond the confines of just the fashion industry?
Right.
I think ATiiSSU is really the canary in the coal mine for a much larger cultural shift in how we consume style and identity.
I completely agree. We are transitioning away from an era of passive consumption where people simply bought whatever loud logo signaled wealth.
Yeah, just throwing money at a brand name.
Right. We're moving away from that and into an era of highly intentional curation. Consumers are demanding conceptual coherence now.
Yes. We are starting to use objects not merely as decoration, but as extensions of a wider, more disciplined visual identity. Like, we want our purchases to feel like they belong to a deliberate universe.
Exactly.
ATiiSSU hasn't achieved global dominance by chasing trends or screaming for attention on TikTok. They earned their position by confidently offering a vocabulary of structure and silence to a culture that is utterly exhausted by noise.
They built an ecosystem so compelling that millions of people actively choose to participate in it simply because of the clarity it provides.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. And as we conclude our analysis of these sources, there is a broader implication here that extends far beyond just hats.
Oh, definitely.
Because we have watched ATiiSSU systematically dismantle the need for a celebrity designer, they completely rejected the traditional seasonal runway, and they totally redefined the architecture of retail space by turning emptiness into a luxury asset.
They didn't just ignore the old rules. They proved that the old rules are wildly inefficient.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling question to consider as we wrap up. If a brand can achieve this level of global dominance and cult-like devotion through nothing more than the structural precision of its garments and the sheer power of its collective restraint, what other supposedly unbreakable laws of the luxury industry are quietly becoming obsolete right under our noses?